Welcome everybody to Christchurch. Welcome to Lives Remembered. And I've been excited about this evening for a while because it's been lovely to hear from Nicholas of the work that's been going on, which you're going to hear about this evening. There's a lot of stories which are going to be told, and lots more which there won't be time to tell, which Nicholas has been discovering along the way. The plan for the evening is fairly simple. Nicholas is going to talk for about an hour, telling us some of those stories and how he's come across them, and then afterwards have your questions ready, because there'll be a little bit of time for question and answer at the end. So if you've got a question, make a note, and there'll be a chance to ask some of those questions at the end. Should you need them, the toilet facilities are available through there. So if you go through the archway and keep going, and if you leave the building, you've gone too far. But it's over that direction. And there will be more refreshments, tea, coffee, and cakes and things like that available at the end. But I'm going to hand over to Nicholas now, and big warm welcome to you and to him.
I think that's a few nods. Lovely, good. Well, thank you so much for coming, and as David said, I'm going to speak for about an hour or just over. I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction, set the scene for all the names on the memorial, and then I'm going to share with you about 15 stories. My difficulty this evening is there are 175 names on the memorial. I've managed to track down 160 of them, and you can see the fruit of that on the pews round about. And I've had to choose 15, which has been an impossible task, but I've made my choice. Other people will have made other choices. And then we'll have a short reflection at the end before then I open it up to questions, and David will do the roving microphone. But let me begin. To the glory of God, and in grateful memory of those who gave their lives for king and country and a righteous cause, I dedicate this memorial. May all who look upon it realize the peace of sins forgiven, the joy of faithful service, and the power of the endless life to which may God vouchsafe to bring us all, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. And with those words, Bishop Taylor Smith, the Chaplain General to the Forces, dedicated the beautiful memorial that we have here behind us this evening. And in a newspaper report in the Hendon and Finchley Times, the journalist gave a description of the memorial. And can I invite you to stand and turn round and look at the memorial as I read the journalist's description, which was published on the 28th of March 1919, saying, "The memorial has taken the form of a scroll group of the Ascension over the west door of the church," referring, of course, to Jesus' ascension to heaven 40 days after the resurrection of Easter Day, "and is carved out of stone left by the architect for this purpose. The crockery and richly carved canopies are of a fine stone, while 3 panels on each side of the door, upon which the heroes' names are to be inscribed." So on this occasion, the 3 panels on each side were blank. After all, this is only 4 months after the end of the First World War. And the panels are of Jean de la Matin marble, and a provision has been made in the 2 end buttresses for 2 3-foot statues. On one side of a soldier, which as we look at it is on the far right-hand side, slightly hidden by the screen, and on the left-hand side as we look at the sailor. Of course, no representative of the Royal Air Force, a very junior service which only was officially created as a 3rd service on the 1st of April 1918. If funds are forthcoming for the same, well, I'm very pleased to say that the funds were forthcoming, because we can see the soldier and the sailor there now. And the article concluded in this way: the memorial forms a very handsome addition to the church and perpetuates in a fitting manner the sacrifice of 130 to 150 men who fell in the Great War. Well, they added a few more. It came at 175 at the end. The spirit of the service at which the memorial was dedicated on Thursday night was in keeping with the victory which the memorial symbolizes. Please do be seated. So a little bit of an overview, briefly, because I want to get to the stories, and that's probably what you're most interested in. But because I can only look at about 15 people, I felt we needed to honour the other 145 I've researched by giving you just a few minutes of overview. And I've researched fully 156 names, of which 140 served in the army. Only 8 in the Navy, because we're not Southampton or Plymouth or Portsmouth, where if you go to the war memorials there, all of them served in the Navy and hardly any in the Army. 1 in the Australian Expeditionary Force, someone who emigrated from England and came back under the Australian banner. 4 similarly in Canada, 1 from South Africa who was born in North Finchley, and 1 from New Zealand, who was born in New Zealand, and I had to spend a lot of time trying to work out what on earth he was doing on the war memorial here, because he had no connection, seemingly, to North Finchley at all. I will tell you his story in a minute. Some interesting facts. Don't worry about the fact you can't read the names. I wasn't quite sure how it would turn out. There are 3 brothers on the memorial, and from the same family, and I will tell you briefly their story as my last story, because I think it's one of the saddest and most moving stories. There are 11 pairs of brothers. There are more surnames with the same, like Smith or Taylor, but they were not actually brothers, but there are 11 pairs. And you can't read it very easily, but the Cheneys died within 72 days of each other. The Currells died within 37 days of each other. And even more tragically, the Normans died within 30 days of each other. Can you just imagine the grief for the parents? You get a telegram telling you that one son has died, and within a matter of weeks, you get the second telegram. The age range is quite wide. Of course, most of the men on the memorial were late teens or in their 20s. The youngest, the infamous or famous John Parr, the first British soldier to die on the Western Front on the 23rd of August 1914, who was only 17, and about who was much on the anniversary in 2014 when the Prime Minister Theresa May, of course, went to the cemetery in Belgium where he's buried. And the last casualty died in November 1919. There were 6 who died in 1919. You might suggest from war wounds or influenza with the pandemic or other causes, as we shall hear. Inevitably, the most common ranks were the privates, that's the lowest class in the army, or second lieutenants, which is the most junior officer in the army, and the second lieutenants and the lieutenants used to go over the top with the men. So inevitably, high level of casualties there. Because of the demography around North Finchley in terms of housing and occupation and the profile of the people, a lot of the people on the memorial were labourers or clerks, working class or artisans. Not many wealthy people, because there weren't grand houses in this part of Finchley compared with, say, Hendon Lane in Church End, Finchley Central. Only 4 lieutenants, that's the next one up in rank seniority from second lieutenants. No captains, no majors, nothing senior, because that was not the kind of people that live round here. 3 prisoners of war, one of whom I'm going to talk about, all of whom died in 1918 in Germany. And as you would expect, as the war developed from August 1914, the 7 who died in 1914 were regulars. They were part of the British Army, before the war started. As the war developed and the British Army grew rapidly to, substantive sums, over 1 million soldiers by the end, you've got the number of deaths going up each year. And of course, some of the deaths in 1918 and some in 1919 were from the pandemic, the Spanish flu. Where did people die? Well, inevitably, the most common location, Belgium or France, the Western Front, where the British Army was most intensely involved over the 4 years of the campaign. 13 are listed on the Menin Gate at Ypres, and 12 on the Thiepval Memorial in the Somme. I think there are 9 on the Arras Memorial in France too. But then there were other places reflecting the World War nature geographically, 2 in Turkey, one of whom died in a submarine incident, and I'm going to tell you about that. It's quite a lovely and famous story. A couple in Greece because of the Salonika campaign. One in Israel-Palestine is buried in Gaza. One who died of heat stroke in Iraq. Now, this is not unusual. One of the people on St. Paul's Finchley Memorial, which I researched previously, also died of heat stroke in Iraq. And the temperature there got up to over 50 degrees Celsius, and a whole range of people died because of heat stroke. Germany, I mentioned the prisoners of war. One died in Egypt, and then, of course, inevitably, some died here in the United Kingdom and are buried in some of our local cemeteries. War wounds, invalided out, and then, of course, some died at sea, just a few, I said, in the Navy, and died in home waters. There's the overview. Now to the stories. Well, Frank Williams is a really interesting character. When you see Royal Navy, you think, well, it must have been on a ship. But actually, he wasn't. As you can see, he was on a submarine. Now, the submarine service was embryonic in the First World War, and certainly pre-World War I, it was a very hazardous business. Let me tell you a little bit about Frank Williams. He was born in Hampstead in 1890, and he had 3 siblings who were all sisters. At the time of the 1891 census, they were living in 231 Finchley Road, Hampstead, and his father was an ironmonger employer. He enlisted in the Royal Navy in December 1909, so nearly 5 years before the war began. And he joined as a fitter and joiner. He was a stoker initially, and then moved around training depots and so on, and got transferred here, there, and everywhere, and eventually promoted to stoker class 1. And then in December 1911, he changed rating to engine room artificer 4th class, the lowest class. Possibly, I believe, in connection with his transfer to the submarine service. An engine room artificer was a specialized position in the crew of naval vessels, usually a fitter and turner or boilermaker or coppersmith or engine smith by background, which of course he was a fitter and joiner. So competent in the working of engines and boilers, and trained in the maintenance and operational use of all parts of marine engines. Now, the valor of being in the submarine service was significant because several boats fell victim to being run down by merchant vessels, others suffered petrol explosions or were overwhelmed by seawater, and the working environment of submariners was described by one of them as, quote, a little like living inside the bonnet of a motor car. Even when the boat was running on surface, with the hatch open, those inside were invariably intoxicated from the noxious engine fumes, giving the appearance of being drunk. And pre-war, the casualty rate was shocking. Altogether, 90 ratings and 18 officers were killed prior to the outbreak of the war. And remember, the submarine service, you could almost count the number of submarines on the fingers of 2 hands. It was no wonder that Winston Churchill, who at the time, of course, was First Lord of the Admiralty, and then in 1939 he got the same job again at the outbreak of the Second World War, came to say of the submariners' lot, of all the branches of men in the forces, there is none which shows more devotion and faces grimmer perils than the Submariners. In 1913, he married Lucy Day, and they had one daughter born in 1914. And the circumstances of Frank's death are as follows. He was serving aboard E20, which is on the screen there, which had been commissioned on the 30th of August 1915. And in November of 1915 was operating in the Sea of Marmara, a small inland sea located entirely within the borders of Turkey that connects the Black Sea to the Aegean Sea. And E20 was due to rendezvous with the French submarine Turquoise. But unfortunately, Turquoise ran aground under Turkish guns and was hastily abandoned. Instead, a German submarine, UB-14, kept the rendezvous and torpedoed the unsuspecting British E-20. 21 members of the crew were killed in the attack, and 9 were captured as POWs, one later dying in captivity. Of course, Frank was among the 21 who died in the incident, and his death was reported in the Hendon and Finchley Times as follows. Much sympathy is felt for Mr. and Mrs. Walter Williams of Regent's Parade, North Finchley, in their anxiety concerning the fate of their only son, Frank Williams, who was a member of the crew of submarine E-20, which the Admiralty last weekend announced had not communicated since the 8th of October. The E-20, on which young Williams was engineer room artificer, was on detached duty in the Sea of Marmara, and it is believed was sunk by the Turks in the Dardanelles. The enemy report states that 3 of the officers and 6 of the crew have been made prisoners, and hopes are entertained that Williams is among the number, although no tidings can up to the present be gleaned. The young petty officer, who's in his 26th year and been in the Navy for 6 years, has seen much service since the war broke out. First, he was on E3, which was sunk after he had been transferred to E7. Then he formed part of the crew of E16, and his former boat was also sunk. After a short time, he was again transferred to the even more modern underwater craft E20. He was in several dogfights off the North Sea, including the engagement off Heligoland and one off the Dogger Bank. A keen officer and genial gentleman, we yet hope he may still be alive to take part in further deeds of daring for his country's sake. Well, sadly, as we know, he did not come through the action and was one of the 21 who died in that incident. An unusual story to have a submariner on the church's war memorial. Story number 2 is entirely different by contrast, and this concerns Private John Mott, who, as you can see, was 40 years old, which is extremely old. Very rarely that you had people in their 40s serving in the armed forces. The cutoff, I think, was 41. But there were some exceptions, and the oldest, as I said earlier, was 48 on the memorial. And does anybody know what the photograph is? It's very local, not very far from here. It is St. James the Great, Friar Barnet, which is now used by a Greek Orthodox community. John was born in 1878 in Surrey, nowhere near here, and his father was a gardener. He seemingly had no siblings. In 1981, he married Louisa Collins at St. John's Church in Islington. He was working as a traveller, and his address in the marriage register is Aldershot, Hampshire. They had 3 children, one born in Basingstoke, one in Aldershot, and one in Strood, Kent. And at the time of the 1911 census, they were living in High Wycombe. They moved around a lot. He was a traveller. But by 1911, he was working as a domestic gardener. On the 10th of December 1915, aged 37 and 7 months, he enlisted in the army, stating that he was working as a tram driver learner. and lived at 1 Finchley Villas, Finchley Park, North Finchley. Initially put on the reserve list, in May 1916 he was mobilised, and the next day he was sent to Grove Park, an Army Service Corps training depot in the London borough of Lewisham, where he was attached to the learners section lorry driver. And a number of months later, he passed his learner's test. And in December 1916, went from Southampton to Le Havre, France, and served initially with the Heavy Artillery Mechanical Transport Company that was attached to the Royal Artillery. And he moved around in different locations in 1917. But then the story in November 1917 takes a sad turn. For on the 17th of November 1917, John had an epileptic fit and was hospitalised. A few weeks later, he was admitted to number 2 Stationary Hospital at Le Havre, and on the 14th of December arrived back in the UK. Following a medical examination at Norwood Depot in South London, a report dated the 10th of April 1918 and signed by Captain Morgan, Royal Army Medical Corps, includes the following. He states he never had an illness in civilian life. He states that he drove an ammunition lorry for 7 months in France. During the last 2 months, much exposed to shell fire, got very shaky and had headaches. And on the 17th of November, had a fit and got admitted to hospital, being discharged a month later, sorry. But then he had further fits, he says, on the 20th of January and the 5th of February. He went to Ballet, a command depot, a convalescent camp, and returned from there in mid-February, suffering from epilepsy. Was an unsuitable case for a command depot, a convalescent place. He returned to this depot where he had several further fits and was sent to Croydon Hospital for observation for a month. They report epilepsy. There are no physical signs of epilepsy. There's been nothing like an epileptic attack since his admission here. But the report goes on to say that his disability was attributable, quote, to service during present war. That was really important for his future, for his wife, not least in terms of military pension. And the report went on to say that his disability was not due to constitutional or hereditary factors, but was aggravated by service during the war, or attributable to, or aggravated by want of proper care on John's part. In other words, it wasn't self-inflicted. The report went on to say, he complains of headaches and giddiness, fits generally preceded by fingers going dead, general weakness. On examination, his tongue is rather coated, but there are no marks of it having been bitten. He looks heavy and not very intelligent. Pulse regular in force and rhythmic, arteries not thickened, heart and lungs normal, but physique poor. They were not unafraid about calling a spade in those days, were they? I have myself on 2 occasions seen him in an epileptic fit, and that was a handwritten note on the report signed by Lieutenant James Smith, Royal Army Medical Corps. And the report ended with a recommendation that he be discharged as permanently unfit and that he be given a pension as his condition was due to active service. And so on the 14th of June 1918, he was discharged. And his last known address was indeed 1 Finchley Villas, Finchley Park, North Finchley. As to cause of death in May 1919, unknown. But I do not think it will be unreasonable to think that it was related to the epilepsy. Maybe he died of an epileptic fit, or without being too explicit, maybe there was another factor that brought his life to an end. His son was married in 1931, and he worked as an engineer. And at the time of the 1939 registers, his daughters were living in Wandsworth, South London, both working as shorthand typists. And that is the story of John Mott. I think it's fair to say that there's a connection here to ill health issues and, you know, the whole question of post-traumatic stress syndrome and shell shock and other things. Obviously, there's a physical manifestation here, And interestingly, the medical authorities in that report seem to acknowledge that, which in a way earlier in the war, perhaps they would not have. If one can have favourites, Frederick Goodyear is one of my favourites, not least because he's also on the War Memorial in St Paul's Finchley, of which I was vicar for 20 years. And this is Frederick's story, because for some reason he also appears on the memorial in this building. Frederick was born in North Finchley in Granville Road on the 5th of March 1887. His father owned a prosperous coal business and was an active participant in public life. He had 3 siblings, one of whom became a curator at the Geology Museum within University College London in the 1930s. And she even had a room in the building named after her. Frederick was educated at Christ College, Finchley. And in 1902, he passed on to University College School in Hampstead, where he remained until 1905. And his school record is littered with achievements and prizes spanning from chess, literature, cricket, cadet corps, and the sciences. He was very gifted in languages, speaking and writing in French, German, Welsh, Latin, and Greek, in addition to English. His housemaster at Hampstead School wrote of him, "His striking appearance and incisive manner arrested attention. His interests were literary and artistic rather than academic. Essentially an eclectic, he found it difficult to concentrate on subjects that bored him." How many teachers have written that over the years in school reports? Frederick Goodyear was not a boy who readily followed the crowd. No housemaster could have had a more capable and loyal house captain. Well, his report said that he might not have been very academic, but actually he clearly was very able academically, because he won a scholarship to Brasenose College, Oxford, where he studied from 1905, and he spent 5 years rather than the normal 3 at the university. His tutors acknowledged him as the ablest man to enter the college in their time. Upon leaving Oxford, Frederick reported on cricket for the Field magazine, as well as contributing essays and other writings to various publications. And for some of 1913, he lived in Paris, where he wrote a long autobiographical novel. Couldn't have been that long because he was so young. But early in 1914, he left journalism and took up the temporary assistant post at Charterhouse School in Surrey, but didn't last very long there, and agreed to write a series of books on British sports. However, he soon realised that he didn't want to, and he accepted a post within the Oxford University Press in Bombay. Within months of his arrival in India, the fighting in Europe broke out and rapidly spread, so he resigned his post as quick as he could and sailed back to England, arriving in January 1915. He felt it was duty to enlist, so he did in the Artist Rifles. But as you can imagine, he wasn't particularly well suited to military discipline, and he could not easily gain a commission. But he did eventually secure a transfer to the Royal Engineers in September 1915, quote, "for special duties," with the rank of corporal. And for 11 months he remained behind the lines and spent a great deal of time studying the flora and fauna of France and Flanders, as well as his supposed objects of study. A medical report dated the 20th of December 1950 stated, quote, "Vision defective both eyes for distance, but is sufficiently good for special service with the meteorological section of the Royal Engineers, subject to the wearing of glasses." So he duly did indeed spend time in the meteorological service. But in August 1916, he got sent back to England and finally managed to get a commission in the Essex Regiment. And in March 1917, he left once again for France, just in time for the Battle of Arras, where on the 12th of May, his battalion went into action. And during an attack, a shell fell on his dugout and he was buried. Though found, his left leg was so damaged that it required amputation. Letters he wrote at this time are clear and cheerful, describing the incident and answering his correspondents' questions about migratory birds. However, his right leg also required amputation on the 22nd of May. And Frederick died at the 1st Canadian Casualty Clearing Station from the effects of shock on his weakened state in the early hours of the following morning. Frederick described himself as a convinced Christian, and his letters are full not only of news and bird watching, but also of theological reflections and commentaries on church goings-on. Though in one letter of 1905, he describes himself as close to atheist as anything else, and believes that religion would die out, leaving only philosophy. But by 1911, he writes, "I am really a Christian." After the war, in 1920, his friends published a collection of his letters and remains, which Oxford University Press agreed to publish on their behalf. Frederick's story is in great contrast to many of our others. Here is an Oxford graduate, clearly an academic and a very interesting character, who paid a very heavy price in terms of war wounds and the ultimate price of losing his life. Henry Baggs is one of our 3 prisoners of war, and he is also on the War Memorial in St Paul's, Finchley. Now this is his story. He was born in Islington in 1882, and he had 7 siblings and 2 others who died by the time of the 1901 census, so we don't know their dates or details. He was educated at the Grocers' Company School, later known as Hackney Downs School, from January 93 to February 98, while he and his family were living in Wood Green. At the time of the 1901 census, his father was working as a solicitor's clerk, and Henry himself was an insurance office clerk, with the family living in Hornsey. 10 years later, in 1911, the family was still living in the same house in Hornsey, and he was still working as an insurance clerk. The 17th of April 1914 edition of the Hendon and Finchley Times reports that Henry's brother Charles has been elected as a sidesman at the Easter Vestry meeting at Christ Church, North Finchley. On the outbreak of war in August 1914, Henry enlisted, saying that he had 8 years' experience in the territorials, and he initially served as a signalman and spent 9 months on the Western Front from July 1915 to April 1916. In January 1916, he applied for commission to become an officer, using Major John Newman, Member of Parliament for Enfield from 1910 to 18, and Member of Parliament for Finchley from 1918 to 23 as his character reference. And he returned, therefore, to the UK to go to the Officer Cadet Battalion training in Bristol. He became a second lieutenant in the Machine Gun Corps and returned to service at the end of 1916. And in August 1917, admitted to hospital in Boulogne with neuralgia, but recovered, and then had 2 weeks leave in the UK at the end of November 1919. On the 24th of March 1918, 3 days after the launch of the massive German spring offensive on the Western Front, which was designed to knock out France and the United Kingdom forces before the American troops really made a difference, coming over across the Atlantic in their tens of thousands every day, the Germans were able to transfer amazing numbers of troops from the Eastern Front, having settled the war with Russia with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in the end of 1917. So they had all this excess personnel. And on the 21st of March 1918, they launched a massive attack on the Western Front, which really nearly knocked the French and British out. But the British and French just managed to hold the line. Backs to the wall kind of statement. And 3 days after the offensive was launched, Henry went missing. German records reveal that he was taken prisoner on the 25th of March, and he died of wounds whilst held as a prisoner of war in Germany. The stated cause of death, as recorded by the Germans and set out in the records held by the International Committee of the Red Cross, was nephritis, which is damage to the tiny filters inside the kidneys. Apparently, Private Spargo, a chaplain, read the burial service, though the Museum of Army Chaplains website has no record of a British Army chaplain of this name, and certainly Army chaplains were never privates. I imagine it was a layperson who took the funeral service, no chaplain being available. It's noteworthy that the British section of the Netherlands legation made representations to the German authorities regarding ill treatment of prisoners at a number of camps, including the camp that Henry was at, but these were refuted. You can imagine by 1918, with the blockade, the food situation in Germany was critical. Many children were stunted. When you look at the medical records of heights of children in 1914 versus 1918, there is not the natural progression of development you'd expect. That's all because of changes in the diet, because of the blockade. And this was particularly felt by prisoners of war, because they were the lowest of the low. They would not be fed as well as the civilians would have been fed. Henry's death was reported on the 9th of August 1918 in the Hendon and Finchley Times as follows. News has been received by Mr. and Mrs. C.J. Baggs of Clovelly, Friar Barnet Road, that their son, Second Lieutenant Henry Ernest Baggs, Machine Gun Corps, has died of wounds whilst a prisoner of war in Germany. The gallant young officer was wounded in action on the 24th of March and reported wounded and missing. Subsequently, his parents learned he'd been taken prisoner, and recent letters from Germany would seem to have conveyed the idea he was recovering. But a few days ago came information that he'd passed away. Mr. C.J. Baggs is one of the sidesmen of Christ Church, North Finchley. So Henry had no connection to this church whatsoever, except his brother was a sidesman here. And you can imagine that poor old vicar had his ear bent and said, "I want my brother on the war memorial, please." The same conversation almost certainly happened with regard to his other brother, who was the organist at St. Paul's, Finchley. And I think that's why he's also on the memorial in St. Paul's, Finchley. The organist's brother died in 1960, and I think was organist for about 50 years at St. Paul's. But there is a plaque in the church of St. Saviour's, Hanley Road, Finsbury Park, which is on the PowerPoint screen. Now, I realise it's very difficult to read the inscription, so I'm going to read it for you. In beloved and honoured memory of Henry Ernest Baggs, 2nd Lieutenant Machine Gun Corps, wounded in action in France, 24th of March 1918, died in Germany, 30th of June 1918. A devoted worker among the boys of this parish. Quote, "I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith." That last sentence is from the Bible, 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 6, and leaves me with no doubt that Henry was a practicing Christian. At the time of his death, his parents were living on Friar Barnet Road, and therefore his name is also included in the First World Memorial in St. James's, Friar Barnet, the Greek Orthodox Church as it is now, that we had a photograph of earlier. That's the story of Henry Baggs. And remember, there are 2 others on the memorial who died in the prisoner of war camps in Germany. Now we come to a very important person in Christ Church's history. And this is Edwin Tarry. And you can see there is the memorial that was put in this building after his death. And I think David is just going to go and get it for us because it's on the table over there. Thank you. Henry was born in 1879. And he had 9 siblings, as far as we know. And at the time of the 1881 census, The family were living in North Mimms, Hertfordshire. His father was farming 106 acres with 4 men and a boy. On the 10th of June 1907, Edwin married Ethel Horner in St Michael's Wood Green, and they had 4 children, the last of whom was born in 1916. And at the time of the 1911 census, the family was living in Fallow Court Avenue, North Finchley, which is literally about 2 minutes' walk from here. He was an assurance clerk, and he died on the first day of the Battle of Arras in 1917. The personal inscription on his headstone, which sadly was subsequently destroyed, was, "As many are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God," which is from the Bible, Romans chapter 8, verse 14. And his death was extensively reported in the 27th of April 1917 edition of the Hendon and Finchley Times, as follows. "Yet another North Finchley man has made the supreme sacrifice and laid down his life for his country. Private Edwin Hart Tarry of the London Regiment was one of the best known men in the district and had won the esteem and respect of everyone who knew him. A resident of Fallow Court Avenue, North Finchley, Private Tarry was a sidesman at Christ Church, North Finchley, and also treasurer of that branch of the Church of England's Men's Society, and his loss was keenly felt when he joined the colours in July last year. He was dispatched to the front in the following February and was killed in action on Easter Monday, April 9th. Private Tarry was 38 years of age, and previous to enlistment was in the employ of the Prudential Assurance Company. The utmost sympathy is felt with Mrs. Tarry and her little ones in their bereavement." And then, a month later, there is another report in the Hendon and Finchley Times, which is headed, "Memorial Service at Christ Church, North Finchley. The number of men of the parish of Christ Church, North Finchley, who are giving up their lives for their country is rapidly mounting, and the vicar, the Reverend W. Laporte Payne, endeavours that all the memorial services held in Christ Church, the names of those men of the parish who made that great sacrifice shall be mentioned." There were 9 names at the latest impressive service last Sunday afternoon, where many of the relatives of the deceased soldiers and numerous congregation gathered. The pulpit was draped with the Union Jack, and whilst the service was solemn, a distinctly bright and hopeful note was maintained. Then it reports a little bit out on the vicar's sermon, and then lists the 9 people who were remembered at that service, one of whom was Edwin Hart Tarry. It concludes, "Tarry was sidesman of Christ Church and treasurer of the Church of England Men's Society local branch. He was," said the vicar, "always very deeply interested in missionary work, and for some years gave a good subscription to provide a cot at the Poki Hospital," that's in Pakistan, "and at the reverend gentleman's suggestion, offerings placed in the church box at the conclusion of the service were given to that fund." And there is mention of his support of that bed in the hospital on the plaque just below me here. If you've never seen it before, I encourage you to take a careful look at it. At the time of the 1939 register, Ethel, his widow, was living with one of their children, Mary, a music mistress, at farmhouse Little Nast Hyde in Hatfield, Hertfordshire. It seems she did not remarry. Now we come to someone whose connection to Christ Church North Finchley is at very best tenuous. If you look very carefully afterwards at the panel, which, as the way I'm looking at it, is the furthest one on the right, it's where the W's and the Y's are, the end of the list of all the names. And right at the bottom, there suddenly appear 2 people with the surname Carruthers. And when I saw that, before I started my research, I thought, what on earth are they doing out of alphabetical order? The C's are over there. Why are they over there? Well, I thought to myself, oh, I know what's happened. Probably they died in 1919 or 1920 or 21 after the inscription's all been done, and so they've been slipped in at the end, which was not uncommon. Well, I don't think that was the reason, and here is the story. Walter was born in New Zealand on the 1st of January 1894. And he had 5 younger siblings, the last of whom died in 1992. He was educated at Wellington College, one of the oldest boys' secondary schools in New Zealand. And within a week of the war being declared in August 1940, Walter enlisted in the New Zealand Field Ambulance and gave his occupation as clerk with the Bank of Australia. Within a month, he'd embarked on a transport ship for Egypt with many troops and horses, arriving there in October 1914, expecting to take part in operations against the Turks, the Ottoman forces. In February 1915, he was ill for 4 days with diarrhea, and in April 1915, he was diagnosed with appendicitis. It's amazing what they write in the records. From January 1916, he was based on the west side of the Suez Canal. And then, on the 6th of April 1916, he embarked from Alexandria for France, where at the end of that year, he was awarded the Military Medal for gallantry under fire. In March 1917, he was promoted to Lance Corporal. In June of that year, wounded in action, but recovered. And at the end of July, he had 2 weeks' leave in Paris. At the end of October 1917, he was awarded a bar to his military medal for acts of gallantry. And at the end of the year, he was promoted to sergeant. He's getting very senior in the NCOs, the non-officer ranks. At the beginning of 1918, he applied to become an officer. And on the 23rd of February, he left for England and was based in an officer cadet unit training in the grounds of Corpus Christi College, the University of Cambridge. Rather a plush location for a bit of training, I'd have thought. And on the 8th of March, he joined the 2nd Battalion, the Wellington Regiment, in the New Zealand Imperial Forces. In a confidential report on him from a lieutenant colonel, dated 29th of June 1918, it said that his standard of education, military knowledge, power of command and leadership were all fair. And concluding remarks were painstaking, has improved considerably. And at the end of June 1918, he duly got his commission and became a 2nd lieutenant. And then on the 7th of September, he returned to France, joining his battalion 2 weeks later. 12 days thereafter, he was killed in action, just a few weeks before the armistice. So there we are. I've researched all of that and thought to myself, what's that got to do with North Finchley? And why is he on the memorial? And is that the Walter Carruthers that is on the memorial anyway? Have I got it wrong? Well, I did a bit more digging around and came across the 1871 census, well before he was born, to discover that his father was living in Long Lane, East Finchley. And at the time of the 1881 census, he was living in Ballards Lane, North Finchley. When exactly his father emigrated to New Zealand is unknown, but it's obviously before he got married in New Zealand in 1892 and had various children, including Walter. Then I discovered, from looking carefully at the census records, that he had a number of relatives who remained living in North Finchley, including his aunt, Mary, who lived in North Finchley pretty well the whole of her life, from 1858 to 1929. So I suspect dear old Mary is the reason why Walter is on the War Memorial. Interestingly, as I said, there are 2 Carruthers, not just Walter, but there's another one. And then I thought to myself, oh, I wonder if they're related. And guess what? They are. They're cousins. And William Carruthers served as a private in the 47th Battalion of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, because instead of going to Australasia, he went off to Canada, but was born in the London borough of Bromley. So unlike Walter, he was a British national, emigrated to Canada before the war, joined the Canadian Armed Forces, and died on the Western Front. But dear Auntie Mary wanted him remembered in North Finchley, and so he's there, along with his cousin Walter. Well, make what you like of that, but that's my interpretation of the story. Now, this next one needs to come with a health warning. The cause of death of William Collins might be triggering, so just be aware of that, and if you need to pause or take a breath or slip out, then feel free to do so. But there are some very tragic stories concerning war, and Gwilym's is one of them. Gwilym was born in Finchley in June 1895. He had 5 siblings and a number of half-siblings from his father's previous marriage. I think his first wife probably died in childbirth or something like that. And at the time of the 1901 census, the family was living in Dale Grove, North Finchley. His father was a printer's manager at a letterpress. And 10 years later, at the time of the 1911 census, the family had moved and was living in Hutton Grove, North Finchley. His father was still working as a printer's manager at a letterpress, and Gwilym now was old enough to be in the workforce and was employed as a commercial clerk for an electrical cable manufacturer. He was educated at Finchley County School, which started as Finchley Higher Elementary School. Oops, yes, there we are. But became Finchley County School in 1910, and it's on the junction of the High Road and Squires Lane. And if you walk along there, you will see there's a memorial plaque for First World War and Second War pupils, and Gwilym is listed on the memorial. On the 17th of February 1913, so some 18 months before war was declared, he enlisted in the Middlesex Brigade Company Army Service Corps. An outbreak of war, he was based at Barnet, and a week later was in Sittingbourne, Kent, and then, very shortly thereafter, sailed for Gibraltar, where he spent the whole of his wartime service, dying there on the 6th of January 1918. And I thought to myself, dying in Gibraltar and serving in the Army Service Corps, that seems a little unusual. Gibraltar was a probably rather safe place to serve. And the Army Service Corps was often made up of people who were either invalided out of the mainstream army, but fit enough to do some manual work, or people for other reasons who were not deemed suitable to serve on the front line. His military record states that his character was very good, and that he died in the Gibraltar Military Hospital following a gunshot wound to the head, suicide, while temporarily insane. And the next day an inquest was held at the hospital which recorded that verdict. On the 22nd of February 1918, the Hendon and Finchley Times reported that there was a memorial service held at Christchurch, North Finchley on the previous Sunday. The vicar was holding these memorial services every 3 months. The service remembered 6 people connected to the church and parish who died in the previous 3 months, and among them was Gwilym. It stated in the newspaper report that he was formerly a non-commissioned officer of the local branch of the Church Lads Brigade, attached to Christchurch, North Finchley. And at the time of his death, his parents were living at 16 Castle Road, North Finchley. And then, in his personnel files, I found this letter written by his father to the War Office, dated 4th February 1919. In other words, 13 months after his son's death by suicide. And it is the most incredible letter It says, "Some weeks since my wife was asked if she could show that our son died as a result of his military service. As his father, may I be permitted to do on her behalf? Ill health is the cause of the delay. We've only been officially informed that death occurred through a gunshot wound in the head and that a verdict of suicide while temporarily insane was returned at the inquest. And I'm therefore unable to offer you any evidence underlined in the legal term that my son died in the service of the country. But those who knew him have never had any other opinion. Perhaps the best way of putting this view before the authorities is to give the lad's life history, temperament and character as we knew them, and leave it to the authorities to make their own conclusions." Born 28th of June 1895, he was always a bright, joyous, self-reliant boy and showed pronounced patriotic properties from a young age. The love of king and country was always very strong in him and showed itself in countless ways. He was one of the earliest members of the Boy Scouts movement and subsequently rose to be a sergeant in the London Diocesan Church Lads Brigade. A county school scholar, he entered the commercial world office of Messrs. W.T. Henley's Telegraph Cable Company, Blomfield Street, EC, City of London, where his prospects of advancement were good. He often expressed his desire to make His Majesty's Army his profession, but his commercial outlook being promising persuaded him from this. Realizing the significance of der Tag, which I think is German for the day, and reading the signs of the times, he showed a relentless wish to prepare himself for the conflict which many people knew to be inevitable. He met my objection by joining the Territorials. He had a great love for horses and served in the local Barnet Company. This was in February 1913, when he was 17 and a half. Throwing his whole interest into the army, he gained his first strike within 6 months and his first year won 4 prizes, including for general proficiency, horsemastership and shooting. And the presentation in February 1914 was complimented by Lord Charlesmore, a very senior British Army officer, a Major General and a member of the House of Lords, chairman of the London County Council, who complimented our son as a promising youngster. A few months later, he was made full corporal. When war broke out, he immediately volunteered for foreign service, expecting to be sent to France. But his company sailed for Gibraltar and remained on the Rock these long, weary years. I cast no blame. I do not complain. I realized the circumstances of war necessitated the sending to and keeping of these comparatively untrained boys at a location which has sometimes been used as a punishment station. But it was undoubtedly, and these words are now underlined, the monotony and confinement of Gibraltar which caused my lad to act as he did. During the past few months he was a patrol corporal, but subsequently promoted to sergeant and even work in the transport office, which was usually done by a lieutenant, and he carried all that work out for 3 years without a break, and I'm informed to the satisfaction of all concerned. He was always felt keenly the monotony of the Rock and disappointed at not being able to take an underlined active part in the defence of his country. Writing home on one occasion, referring to his long sojourn on the Rock, he said, "This is what we get for giving up our Saturday afternoons for training before the war, whilst other fellows who used to content themselves watching football are permitted to go to France." The fact that his younger and less robust brother was fighting on the Western Front distressed his peace of mind. On another occasion, he wrote, "Glorious news! An officer has said that I can go to the Western Front and take my part with Maris, my brother." There was scarcely a letter home which did not say he was chaffing at his captivity. His father continues, "From his colleagues in the company, I've subsequently learned that on several occasions he applied for his papers, namely to be transferred. He was always told he was too useful to be spared. At last, he was recommended for a commission, and he told his colleagues that he had, quote, put in for the Horse Artillery or the Royal Field Artillery, as mathematics being his best subject. He thought that he could serve his country to the best of his ability in those branches of the service. But in December 1917, I am informed his papers were returned, quote, no vacancies. I've heard that commissions are only granted to men that have served or were serving in the ranks of those regiments. From that time, his friend tells me, he seemed to take no further interest in anything other than his work. He was always at his work, and it became a joke amongst his friends that if Sergeant Collins was wanted night or day, he could be found at the office. In all other respects, his letters home were always bright. He was too good a soldier to complain of the amount of his work, but there's no doubt that the monotony of the rock and a deep-seated desire unhappily denied him to be of active service played upon his mind, though, alas, we never suspected that it was upsetting his mental balance. There was no love trouble. The lad was a life abstainer, a non-alcoholic, and virtually a non-smoker. No monetary difficulties, even-tempered, selfless, and judging by his letters home to my wife and I, we'd often remarked there was a good character forming in our son. The chaplain of the South Barracks Church in Gibraltar wrote to his parents and said, I was much attached to him. For some time he was in my choir, and afterwards a regular attendant at church on Sunday evenings. I understand he had been complimented on the way he'd carried out a piece of work only the day before his death. You may rest assured that it was not in any way an attempt to escape from any wrongdoing. I have never heard the slightest suggestion of anything against him. He led a perfectly straight and sober life. The father ends the letter. In conclusion, I would respectfully ask the authorities to give this statement their sympathetic consideration. In it, I have endeavoured to show the lad's irreproachable character and what I am certain led to his mental breakdown and death. And the last sentence is an incredibly wise statement. One can imagine him almost saying, oh, and by the way, P.S., I am taking the liberty of sending this document to Lord Charlesmore, President of the Middlesex County Territorial Association, of which the deceased was originally a member. Well, sadly, there is no evidence in the personnel file that there was a reply to the father's letter, which I think is most incredibly well written, bearing in mind the traumatic circumstances. But I did find in the file that on the 19th of January 1923, almost 4 years after the letter, his father had signed a postcard addressed to the officer in charge Royal Army Service Records at Woolwich Dockyard, acknowledging receipt of his son's war medals. And therefore I think it is not unreasonable to conclude, in one sense, the letter had done its job, and that the authorities did in the end, at least, grant Gwilym his war medals. I recognise that's taken quite a long time, but I thought you would appreciate hearing what his father had to say about his son in the circumstances. Now, I'm really conscious. I'm very nearly up on my 1 hour, so I'm going to have to speed on a little bit now and make some painful choices about which ones to leave out. Oh, by the way, that was a picture of the Gibraltar Barracks. You might have guessed that. Now, I'm going to leave Lebet, but Lebet was a deeply committed member of Christ Church North Finchley. And he was only a member of this church for 2 years before he served, and he was the Sunday school superintendent, responsible for the activities in the life of the church for hundreds of children in this community that were part of the church at that time. And you can see his family wanted to make very clear to everybody his Christian faith, because on the headstone there is that Bible verse from the last book of the Bible in Revelation. I will briefly just share a few words about Leonard Smith, because he served most of his career in the Royal Army Medical Corps. And when you think of the Royal Army Medical Corps, well, I do anyway, I think of stretcher bearers, ambulance drivers, I think of doctors. We've had a medical report read out, didn't we, earlier? Well, our dear friend Leonard was none of those. He was born in Cricklewood in 1896. His father was a stockbroker's clerk. And in 1901, they were living in Willesden. His father died in 1903, at which point they were living in 64 Lincoln Road, East Finchley. At the time of the 1911 census, Leonard and his sister were living with their paternal grandmother, a widow, because their mother had also died, and they were both students. Then I discovered that actually their mother was still alive. She wasn't dead. She was living very nearby in Fortis Green Road. But in the census return, she described herself as deserted wife. Well, her husband was dead. I suppose in that sense you might say he'd deserted her. And then I read on in the records and discovered that 2 years later she died at the St Luke's Hospital for Lunatics in City Road, central London. And from this, I guess that she was not in very good mental health and seemingly not able to take direct care of her children, which why they were living with their paternal grandmother in 1911. So a troubled upbringing. Father died when he was young, when he was just 7, and his mother died before the war and was obviously struggling with her mental health. But in August 1915, aged 19 and 7 months, he enlisted in the Royal Army Medical Corps. And he stated on his application that he was an assistant analyst. I thought, what on earth does that mean? Well, I kept reading and discovered that he had an important role in the Royal Army Medical Corps in his unit. He was a member of the 1st London Sanitary Company. Now, sanitary companies were responsible for ensuring that the water was clean, that the soldiers drank, that the cooking facilities were such that they wouldn't lead to outbreaks of disease and dysentery, that the washing and delousing stations were in order, that waste disposal and incineration facilities were such that it would reduce the risk of sickness and disease amongst the troops. And only highly trained personnel were used in the sanitary service, including sanitary inspectors, architects, engineers, and builders, and so on. A report on his work as an analytical chemist in the Royal Army Medical Corps by Captain Wilson, officer commanding 73rd Sanitary Company, 33rd Division of the BEF, dated 18th February 1917, Leonard is very reliable, very intelligent, well up in chemistry and water analysis in particular. His training in sanitary work with the 1st London Sanitary Company at home and in the field should be very useful to him. He has a good power of command and control and is very tactful in the handling of men. Another report stated that, as of sobriety, he is a teetotaler. Well, he was clearly a capable chap. And so he got a commission as an officer in 1917, and before the year was out, he was killed at the Third Battle of Ypres, known as the Battle of Passchendaele. Perhaps he should have stayed as an analytical chemist with the Sanitary Company. Briefly, very briefly, Trollope is another mental health case, very sad. Fought during the war, clearly not well. At the end of the war, that's a picture of Great Yarmouth Hospital, which is where he was. And then during the course of 1915, his health deteriorated and he died. Precise cause of death, not stated in the records, but was from North Finchley. I'm going to pass on this one. Oh, no, very briefly. This poor man's widow not only lost her husband, But have you worked it out? She lost 2 brothers. And the photographs are of her brothers' headstones, which I took in the summer when I was visiting France. So she had that trauma, as many did, of not just losing a father or a son or a brother or whatever. They had more relatives than just the immediate. And that poor widow in that extended family, having 2 sons, 2 brothers, her husband died, all of North Finchley. Robert French, very briefly, highly able young man, first-year medical student, was educated at Epsom College in Surrey. His father was a renowned North Finchley general practitioner. He is repeatedly referred to in the Hindon and Finchley Times. And tragically, as you can see, his 19-year-old son, or 18-year-old son died in 1916. And anybody know what the photograph is of? Yep. The Dr. French Memorial Home, which was opened in memory of his son and only closed as a nursing home about a year ago as a result of failing inspections with the Quality Care Commission. And it's just round the corner from here, but opened in memory of his son, who no doubt would have become a doctor if he'd not died. Rifleman John Dawson was a very deeply committed member of this church, and that photograph is of a plaque which is somewhere in the building. I can't quite remember where it is, but it is somewhere. Yes, David is pointing. It's on that wall over there somewhere. Edgar Smith died in a tragic accident in Shoebury-in-Ess. You can see he was involved in an artillery place, and he, I think, was probably involved in research. And in May 1915, there was an explosion while they were researching, and he and a couple of other chaps died. And he's buried, as you can see, in Essex, very near to where the incident took place. He was from this community. And to end, the Steeles. As I said, there is one family with 3 sons who died on the War Memorial, and here they are. And just very briefly, as I conclude, William served as a private in the Royal Marine Light Infantry and died aboard HMS Vicnor, a lightly armed merchant cruiser which sank in heavy seas off County Donegal, Republic of Ireland, in January 1915. The sinking was a mystery. It was thought she may have struck a naval mine or perhaps been a target of a German U-boat. She sank without sending any distress signal, and all on board died. 22 officers, 273 ratings in January 1915. And then, 2 years later, Robert, who was a corporal in the Middlesex Regiment, died aged 23 on the last day of the Second Battle of Gaza in Israel, Palestine. The parents have had now the news of 2 deaths. Armistice Day arrives, 11th of November 1918. Everybody's celebrating, and they are thinking, we've lost 2, but we've still got Arthur. Less than 6 weeks later, Arthur is dead and buried in a cemetery in Egypt. Cause of death, unknown. Was it war wounds? Was it the influenza pandemic? We don't know. But he was part of General Allenby's successful campaign against the Ottoman Empire. One son died at sea, no body. Another died in Israel, Palestine. And after the war ended, the third died and buried in Egypt. It is hard to imagine the level of grief that there must have been in the Steele household. He died 7 days before Christmas. Did the family receive the telegram before Christmas or after Christmas? Some families received telegrams of the death of their loved one on Armistice Day itself. Well, that didn't happen in this instance, but not far off. I want to end just with a bit of silence, leaving you to reflect on the words on the headstones of the people on the screen. As we think about all those we've not heard about, as much as those we've had, how do you want to be remembered? What would you want on your headstone? Here is what are on the headstones of some of those listed on this church's war memorial. At the last slide, notice the very profound words concerning the Norman brothers, who died just 30 days apart. David, it's over to you with the walk microphone, and I'll leave you to be the master of ceremonies if people have got any questions.
Yes, so if anyone would like to ask a question, by all means, please do. I have the roving microphone to hand, and I know we can take any questions that there might be for Nicholas. Praise God.
Oh, just hold a second. Let's make sure it's on. I think David's just adjusting something.
Thank you very much for the talk.
You're welcome.
I'm sorry I was late. I had another
That's all right,
appointment.
Anne. Don't worry. I know you had other duties.
It was really interesting that you were talking about some of who suicide and those who had mental health. And I think there isn't enough known or realised about what many of them went through, and it did affect their mental health, and it affect their life when they came back into civilianship as well. And I think that's often not recognised enough. So I thought that was it was sad, but it was interesting that you mentioned that. Thank you.
It's one of the reasons why I felt it was really important to be open and transparent about that, particularly in terms of Gwilym Collins' story. And it's fair to say that during the course of the First World War, I think attitudes began very slowly to change. Obviously, there were what one might today perceive to be rather inhumane treatments or attempts to help men with very severe shell shock, and there's bits of wartime film clips that you can see of people shaking terribly and electric treatment and all. I mean, they were pioneering. They just didn't know what they were dealing with to start with. And of course, there were lots of questions initially about cowardice, and a sense of stiff upper lip and just pull it all together and get on with it. But I think by the end of the war, there was beginning to be a better awareness, and the Royal Army Medical Corps began to develop a deeper understanding. But it was not universal, and it was a bit hit and miss. And of course, this then, as you say, had a big knock-on effect in the 20s and 30s in people. How do they handle, obviously what they didn't know was post-traumatic stress syndrome. A lot of men, both in the First and Second World War, did not talk about what happened, and was this one way of coping. But nightmares and disturbed sleeps and very unsavory behavior all developing as a consequence of the trauma which these people experienced and saw. But I think it's fair to say that we've got one or two ex-service personnel here today. I think it's fair to say that the military authorities have a much better understanding now than they did. I'm not saying it's perfect. It certainly isn't, I suspect. But yes, it was beginning to be acknowledged, but it was very hit and miss and very dependent on the particular provision that you had. I mean, the great thing about that report about Mott, who had the epilepsy, there was an awareness that it was caused by his exposure to constant shelling, whereas, for some would have not been so fortunate in their diagnosis. But thank you for highlighting that.
Just on that subject, slightly related, in the late 50s, I and my parents attended a church not too far from here. Now, the minister had actually served in the First World War and had suffered shell shock. Now, that was manifested by his speech, which was sort of a broken form of speech. And I'm just wondering whether that was a typical of people who'd suffered shock, but had actually managed to get back to a pretty normal life. But this was something that remained with them throughout their life, the speech impediment, down to shell shock.
I'm not a medical expert, and I've not studied the Royal Army Medical Corps to that extent, but I think your reflection is probably accurate, but I do so as a lay person, not as a specialist. But I think it's a very reasonable conclusion I think you've drawn there. Yeah.
Thank you so much. You left us with the headstone messages. I wondered if there was one in particular which spoke to you and why.
Wow. Thank you so much, Alex. I think that's a really, really good question. Of the Christchurch North Finchley ones, I think I was particularly wrestling and struck by the one for the Normans, the two brothers that died 30 days apart. Clearly, the parents were deeply committed Christians and were viewing the death of their sons through their Christian faith lens, if you like. But we cannot, Lord, thy purpose see, but all is well that's done by thee. Now, I have no difficulty with the first part of that. We can't always understand God's purpose in tragedy and trauma, even if we believe that all things work together for good for those who love and follow Jesus Christ. I'm struggling a bit with the second half. But all is well that's done by thee. It's done by thee. I think I'd want to say pastorally that God allowed it. I'm not sure I would say he did it. I think I'd want to say something about, in theological terms, the sinfulness of humanity and the way in which we fall short as human beings of God's ideals. But that's a really deep theological question, but there's also a very real pastoral question here. But I think what I'm understanding the parents wanting to acknowledge, that even in their grief, they're trusting in the sovereignty of God and the providence of God, and their faith is not shaken So if it's my favourite one, I don't know, but I think it's the one that leaves me with a lot of questions. Did you notice that I deliberately interspersed them? That, 1, 3, 5, 7 are very Christian, and 2, 4, and 6 are just general. And I don't cast any negativity or positivity about what has been said there. But I think one of the reflections I have is that this was a society that was deeply shaped by the Christian story, and that many of the people on that memorial that we're talking about were committed Christians. Their households were. That 100 years ago, the Christian story shaped the life of British society in a way which, sadly, it does much less so now. But yeah, I'll leave it there. I could say a lot more, but it's an interesting reflection, isn't it, as to what parents or the widow decided should go on the headstone and why. And remembering that in all our analysis of that, we can't easily put ourselves in their shoes. Thank you for the question, though. Oops. Any further comment or question? I may have stunned you into silence, but we've had some very good questions. Time for at least one more, if not two, if somebody's bursting to say or ask something. Okay, well, David, over to you for the sort of conclusion, I think.
There we go. I wondered if we might do something that we often do on Remembrance Sunday here at Christ Church, which is actually, we'll do this on this coming Sunday. But if you wouldn't mind, as we did at the start of the lecture, to turn and face the memorial over there. And I thought it would be useful as, again, Nicholas has raised the question of how people respond to these things and how we respond to what we've just heard. And I think it might be suitable to actually just be silent for a moment as we think upon the names there. And then, if you'll bear with me, I'm just going to say a brief prayer, and then we'll finish our time together. Lord God, our Father, we remember your promises to look with love on all your people. On this day, we entrust to you all who have suffered during war and carry its scars. Those who've waited anxiously at home. Those who've returned wounded and disillusioned. Those who've mourned. Those communities that were diminished and suffered loss. Remember, too, those who acted with kindly compassion, those who bravely risked their own lives for their comrades, and those who, in the aftermath of war, have worked tirelessly for a more peaceful world. And as you remember them, remember us, O Lord. Grant us peace in our time and a longing for the day when people of every language, race, and nation will be brought into the unity of Christ's kingdom. We ask this in the name of Jesus our Lord. Amen. Amen. I'm just going to draw the evening to a close there and by saying, well, a couple of things. One is there are still tea and coffee and refreshments available over there. please do help yourself. It's all there. Nicholas is still here. Please come and ask him questions and find out more. Notice as well that the biographies that have been left around on the seats, please don't take them with you. We want to gather them up again. But the body of work that Nicholas has produced is a great blessing to us at Christ Church, and we'll be keeping those available for people to see, well, now and in the years to come. And so, as a final thing, I just want to say a personal vote of thanks to Nicholas for the work that he's done and for sharing this evening with us. What a blessing to us. And so I'm giving you that as a little note of thanks from us at Christ Church, and I thought we might show our appreciation in the traditional fashion. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, and I am around if you want to ask anything else.